Bruce Bennett with us from the RAND Corporation. We're lucky to have him. He is the world's foremost expert on North Korea, from what I can tell, or in a very small handful of people who know the most about North Korea in the world. I admire Dr. Bennett because when I do research, I dedicate enough time to something to learn about it and get a publication and move on to something else. This North Korea and the North Korean strategic situation is something that he dedicates his life to and he understands thoroughly. He frequently travels to the region and is a frequent consultant with the United States government and others on these kinds of issues, and does all kinds of publications and research and policy briefings on this very important part of the world. So I'm very glad that we are able to welcome him to campus today. Welcome, Bruce.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I thought I might start with just a little bit about the RAND Corporation for those of you who are not familiar with it. RAND was started in the period directly after World War II. RAND was research and development for the Air Force. The Air Force had learned during World War II, where they could draft anybody they wanted, that the academics that they had brought in were generally very valuable to Air Force planning and understanding. And they wanted to continue that relationship after the war when they couldn't draft everybody they wanted to. So they set up a separate corporation to do that kind of activity. And RAND has continued since that time. Some minor things that you might think that we were involved in the early years. RAND came up with the concept of satellites. That was developed at RAND. RAND came up with the concept of refueling aircraft, another concept developed at RAND. Most of the strategic nuclear relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the concepts were developed at RAND. Since then, RAND has branched out beyond just national security issues. We deal with education, we deal with energy policy, we deal with health care. Many of the concepts that are associated with national health care reform were developed through health care experiments done at RAND that were very large over the 70s and 80s in particular. So RAND does a variety of things. RAND also has a graduate school for those of you who are interested in going on, where all students get fellowships, so it works very nicely for those interested. With that as background, then, let me start talking about North Korea and begin with, it's important to note the region we're talking about. We have China, we have Japan, you can see kind of hidden by the title there, and the Koreas in between. Northeast Asia is a very important region of the world for the United States, and we'll talk here a little about that. But just so you have an idea of the geography, we'll start there. If you look at the capabilities of the area across the world, in terms of GDP as an indication of economics, in terms of population, you have in, of course, North America and in Europe some of your strongest economic capabilities, about a quarter of the economic capability of the world in each. Northeast Asia is just a little bit behind, but at the growth rates that have been happening in recent years, Northeast Asia will have the strongest regional economic capabilities within about 5 to 10 years. Chinese growth rate in particular is averaging somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10% a year, compared to our growth rate before the recession of a couple of percent. So they are really surging forward. Also major population area of the world. Now compared to that aggregate total, North Korea as a country is very small. Population-wise, it's only about 1% of the total of Northeast Asia. Economically, it's in the tenths of percent of the GDP. So in the normal political science terms of power politics, you wouldn't expect North Korea to be that important compared to countries like China, Japan, other countries, even in the region. The reality is there is a new kind of power politics, which I tend to refer to as anti-power politics, and I'll tell you a little bit about that concept as we go on. If you look from a U.S. perspective, about 30% of U.S. imports come from Northeast Asia. Now, these are heavily from China, from Japan, but also from Korea. If you have a Samsung or a Sanyo appliance of any kind, those are Korean. And so those kinds of things, you see Korean cars in the U.S., variety of kinds of sources. Now, what am I going to talk about? So I'm going to talk about what is happening in North Korea, what the problems are, what are the risks that it poses to global security and regional security, and then what can the U.S. do about that? The problem with North Korea to start with is North Korea is a failing state. It hasn't failed. We can't predict that it's going to fail next week or next month or next year. Think about the Soviet Union in the mid to late 1980s. When we looked at the Soviet Union at that time, and I was one of the observers doing a lot of looking at the Soviet Union then, you looked at Gorbachev and you said, wow, he's really in control of this country. I mean, the control is strong, it's relatively stable, and within a couple of years the country had fallen apart. That is the kind of situation you potentially face with North Korea with some extremes. North Korea's economy has already largely failed. It's not unusual for visitors in Pyongyang to look at the industrial plants and to notice out of the smokestacks that there isn't any smoke coming up. And they'll ask the North Korean security people who are guarding them around, well, what's going on? And they'll say, we have perfect emission control. You will not see any emissions from those smokestacks because we've got perfect control. Well, yeah, it's perfect control. They're off. The economy has largely failed, and they don't have enough food even for their military, which is their first priority. They have a military-first attitude in the country, and yet even the military they can't feed well enough. The military actually is increasingly going around and stealing from farmers. So that's how bad it's getting. Increasing criminal and rebellious behavior. You have refugees, probably over 100,000, maybe several 100,000 in China. China does not give them refugee status. And so it's a very difficult situation from them in China. Many of them are in China virtually as slaves. You've got criminal activity, black market's very strong in North Korea, reports of attacks even on Kim Jong-il and on his sons. And then you've got an interesting phenomenon. In a communist society, about 3 years ago, they started loosening control on markets, hoping that the markets would help take care of the economic problems, especially food, because their distribution system wasn't working. And what occurred was that the markets started growing because the elites would skim food out of the distribution system and sell it in the markets. So they were making money in a corrupt manner, and the markets started growing stronger and stronger. Earlier this year, they sent out a decree to shut down the markets except for 1 day a month. And within a couple weeks, they recalled that decree because the elites apparently had rebelled against it. So it's a complicated phenomenon, but with those markets growing, that is undermining the control of the leadership. They can't decide who gets fed. Information from the outside is spreading. 20 years ago, they thought that North Korea was the haven of the world. Now they know it's not. And most people have a fairly good sense that the outside world is just much better off. And you've got Kim Jong-il, poor health. He's reported to have had some kind of surgery last May. In August, September time frame, he appears to have had a stroke. He's been struggling with that, trying to recover. It doesn't look like he's fully recovered. And his succession is unclear. His dad designated him as the successor over 20 years before he finally took power. With Kim Jong-il, he's sort of kind of starting to designate one of his sons as a successor. 6 months ago, if you talked about succession, you could be executed in the country because he was so concerned about not raising the subject. Now he seems to be raising it because he's concerned about the elites. Think about it from the elite perspective. If the wrong person becomes a successor, what happens to you? It's not good. And in particular on that, he's done a particularly strong job. He's taken pictures of the East German elites, the ones who were overthrown when East Germany failed as a country, who are now in miserable conditions, and taken them to North Korea and shown the people how bad it is when the elites lose their power. So the elites are feeling insecure, they're feeling a lot of pressure. Recently he called back many of the diplomats and apparently spies from overseas, and they went through torture for some reason. We don't know why. And when they came back to their posts, not all of them, but some of them, they were in very bad physical shape, apparently having been tortured. So apparently there was some leak or something that was going on. More generally, there seems to be real tensions in the country. Now, in order to survive, North Korea has always had problems with food. It's never been in particularly great shape. North Korea has taken an attitude which would be referred to as diversionary conflict for years. That is, they've tended to blame the outside world for all their difficulties. You're not eating because the United States and Japan and South Korea have taken such contrary policies towards us that we can't feed you, and it's they are the enemy, they've done it to us. But even more extreme, they have talked about war and what would happen if there was ever war on the Korean Peninsula. And as early as 1976, taken from a dialogue between a Korean diplomat and a Hungarian diplomat, they had said that Korean could not be unified in a peaceful way. They were prepared for war. If war occurs, it would be waged with nuclear weapons. So the North Koreans have had a perception for a long time that we would use nuclear weapons in a war. And that helps explain their interest in the nuclear weapons. Okay, so what about the future? We have the current situation, and a lot of people would like to see one of two outcomes. Either a soft landing unification, which is basically that North Korea's leadership suddenly falls apart, South Korea is able to walk into North Korea, everybody is happy, and we go home singing some song and we're all satisfied. Alternatively, they'd like to see smooth regime replacement. Kim Jong-il is replaced by some new leader. He really loves the West. He's very happy to have all of the outside economics and so forth come in, or at least he's happy to have Chinese-style reformation and to be in good shape. The problem with either of those future alternatives is that to get there, you've got to jeopardize the regime because you've got to get rid of the current leadership, the current people in control. And if that happens, then you've got to ask, well, what happened to the elites? The whole concept here of disenfranchised elites. All of the military, all of the security organizations, and if you think security was strong in the old Soviet Union, nothing like in North Korea. Multiple security organizations spying on each other. It is very severe in order to maintain control. Political leaders as well, what happens to them? The fear is that many of them are already involved in criminal activities, as we talked about earlier, with the elites skimming food, and they would simply join the criminal activities more formally after they are displaced. So you have a basis for not so much an insurgency as in Iraq or Afghanistan, as a major criminal activity that could be a successor in North Korea for many of these people that you would then have to deal with. Now, in terms of the overall state of the country, in terms of the viability of the current regime, its ability to survive and to operate, you've got some kind of pattern that looks to be downward headed. The concern is sometimes you're going up, sometimes you're going down, but the overall trend is down. And Kim Jong-il is watching the pattern, but he doesn't know where this cliff is. We don't know where that cliff is. So what he's trying to do is to manage the process. Now, his management in the short term is with provocations. Back in early April, he did a long-range missile launch. He called it a space launch, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Back in 2006, he launched a bunch of missiles after having committed years before to not launching missiles. And he also did a nuclear test in 2006. So provocations are a means now to demonstrate success of the regime. They've achieved something. They can launch a missile. They can do a nuclear test. They're now a nuclear power, they claim. The next step, as you go down, you have to worry is, at some point, do we actually see warfare? Now, we've seen a little bit of that kind of thing in recent years. There have been naval fights in the Yellow Sea, what they refer to as the East Sea, several occasions between North Koreans and South Koreans, but that's been very low level by comparison to what could potentially happen. You could see those kinds of attacks occur, something like that. You could also see an invasion of South Korea. This could be a desperate attempt by the regime to pull the leadership together, to unify the leadership against an external foe as opposed to being against the internal leadership. Or if somehow that fails, you could have a regime collapse. Now, a regime collapse could mean it's just replaced by some military leadership. It could mean that no leader retains power and the country splits into feudal warlords or something like that, or splits into chaos. We don't know what would happen in that kind of situation. We can project, but who knows what would exactly develop. So we have to be prepared for a variety of alternatives. Now, in looking at this situation, this is where the term I was talking about earlier of kind of anti-power politics comes in. If you're familiar with the business world, when a small company wants to prevent being taken over, they institute what's referred to as a poison pill policy. They set up some kind of financial arrangement where if a company takes them over, it's a disaster for that company. It causes them really serious economic problems. Some of the banks, having recently acquired failing savings and loaning organizations, is an example of an unintended poison pill. North Korea didn't intend to set itself up as a poison pill, but it nevertheless has. And in many ways, it's the ultimate which prevents other people from coercing them. North Korea's economy is no more than about 1/30th the size of South Korea's, even though the population is half as much. And to try and recover that economy, it's generally estimated that an investment of $1 to $2 trillion would be required to do that. Well, $1 trillion is the GDP of South Korea. So if you wanted to do that over a 10-year period, you got to institute a 10% tax on everything going on in the country to accumulate that money. Nobody in South Korea wants that. And so that is not a particularly useful situation. There's an extreme health crisis in North Korea. People have been eating so poorly for decades. They now say that roughly 1/4 of the young people going into military service do not mentally qualify for military service. They have been impeded in their mental development and cannot handle military service in the right kind of way. In other words, you've got a whole bunch of loose cannons in their military ranks. That's not a good situation, but think about it from a position of South Korea. If they inherit North Korea, what do you do with those people who probably can't work as well? And that's the mental side. The physical side, huge health care costs for decades to try and recover the situation. That's all according to our national intelligence folks here in the United States. They've recently published a report on that. Refugees. A couple of years ago, South Korea got its 10,000th refugee from North Korea since the Korean War. They're now up to about 15,000, a small number, and yet they've had great difficulty assimilating those people. Those people have been difficult to change to the capitalist way of thinking, difficult to employ, and so forth. And if you had then tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of those people, that would be a problem. They're worried about the military morphing into crime and insurgency, as I was talking about earlier, and the military is large. In North Korea, you have 1 million men active duty and 7 million in the reserves. What do you do with an 8 million man army if it's mobilized? How much force is that going to take to demobilize it and control it after a collapse? Finally, you've got the potential for North Korea doing serious damage as it goes down. It's reported by one of Kim Jong-il's tutors who has defected that in 1993, Kim Il-sung, his dad, had a meeting where he said, we may be going to war with the United States in the next year or so over the nuclear issue. That was before they made the agreement in 94. And his dad said, if we lose that war, what do we do? And Kim Jong-il's response was, I will surely destroy the earth. What good is this earth without North Korea? Now that may sound extreme. He probably can't destroy the earth, but he could sure do a lot of damage with even a few nuclear weapons, as we'll talk about in a bit. Okay, in the 1950s at RAND, one of the vehicles we developed for thinking about this kind of situation is called an escalation ladder. You start at the bottom at relatively low levels of crisis or conflict, and as you go up, you have higher levels. This is looking at the situation in 2006, where in late 2005, the U.S. applied financial sanctions to North Korea. You may have heard of the Banco Delta Asia issue, but that was only a small part of what was going on. North Korea counterfeits about $100 million of U.S. currency each year. Roughly speaking, we believe that's the amount that they produce. Kim Jong-il's attitude is, well, why does the U.S. have the exclusive right to print U.S. currency? Why can't we? So they print U.S. currency. We were trying to stop them. When the financial sanctions started taking hold, North Korea decided in July of 2006 to launch 7 missiles against their previous commitment not to do that kind of thing. They did it on July 4th, obviously pointed at the United States. Immediately thereafter, the UN Security Council instituted Resolution 1695, sanctioning North Korea for that activity. That didn't achieve North Korea's objective. So in October, they did a nuclear test underground. The UN did another resolution after that, even stronger sanctions. And the concern was, well, we would escalate potentially further. So what was going on? The problem is that North Korea tends to follow a policy called escalating brinksmanship. Kim Jong-il's problem is he's in a military-oriented society. If he looks weak, if he says, oh, got it, we're counterfeiting U.S. currency, we shouldn't be doing that. Oh, bad us. We're going to stop. Then he looks weak to the military. And if he looks weak, then he's potentially subject to overthrow. So instead, he's got to look strong, which means he's got to carry out provocations to push so that it looks like we give in the end. And that's what he did in this sequence. The problem is, as he pushes up towards the brink, we get very anxious not to have this go and get worse and go up that ladder. And in the end, as he's working with some of the strongest countries in the world, he often wins. So what happened in 2006? Well, by May 2007, he got an agreement where he got 1 million tons of oil for taking some modest actions on his part as a trade. Well, that was a good outcome for him. He extorted that oil, is what the people in North Korea have been told. So what's his problem today? Now we're in 2009. Well, part of his problem is he personally looks weak, having been sick, probably operated on. His arm is still not working well, apparently from a stroke. He's lost a lot of weight. He looks infirm. His agriculture and economy is doing poorly. He looks like he could be vulnerable to U.S. and South Korean attacks. And he's been working in the six-party talks and maybe giving away his nuclear weapons, if people look at that. And so as you look at the situation, you ask, well, okay, what do we do? At the top part here, he does a space launch, and he looks like we're a powerful country. I mean, how many countries in the world have a space launch capability? Not a lot, and now North Korea is one of them. You look at the situation where he can then claim Japan and the ROC and U.S. are hurting North Korea. We did not this time get a UN Security Council resolution, but we got a position statement. And from that statement, he can say, well, these countries are back at us. They're making all our problems. So they're responsible for what's going on, and he's trying to extort food and oil. When you look at him being vulnerable to U.S. and Iraq attacks, he can say, well, I've got nuclear weapons now. I can deter the United States. And he's doing an excellent job. Listen to U.S. diplomats. The position is usually, if North Korea does X, we'll take severe action against them and, they'll pay the price for it. What prices have they paid historically? Not very much for the actions they've taken. Sanctions usually go away very quickly because who are we trying to sanction? The Chinese usually are the primary importers to North Korea, and the Chinese almost never impose the sanctions for more than a few weeks and only partially. So you've got that kind of situation. And from the North Korean perspective, they had gotten far enough into the six-party talks and the nuclear weapons that they were starting to give things up. By getting into this position, he's now said, no more six-party talks. What he's doing is resetting the six-party talks so that if they're going to start again, they've got to start from scratch, meaning more aid that we're offering that he can claim he's extorted out of his power. So here is one of the weakest countries in the world trying to look like it's a strong country. And it's this anti-power politics kind of notion I'm suggesting. And it's working. The part of the problem here, though, is thinking about it in terms we're familiar with. Think of a chess expert. When a chess expert plays a game, he doesn't just look at what his opponent did and kind of move in reaction to that. He's planning 2 or 3 or 4 moves ahead so that he knows where he's going based upon what his opponent does. He's kind of contingency planned. We don't seem to be playing ahead the way he is. So if you look at that escalation ladder, he apparently has concepts of where he's going. What are those concepts? Well, we started this round with him looking weak. He did the space launch in early April. We have a UN statement in response, which sort of kind of sanctions North Korea, and some independent U.S. sanction activities. So Kim Jong-il looks at that, and he's apparently in this situation concerned about his slipping control in the country. He's worried about regime failure, but not so much as it happening in the immediate future. If he were really worried about the regime failing in the next few months, he'd probably have gone to war. So this is a lower level of concern we project at this point in time. Still, with where he is, he's concerned about this. He's also interested in economics. He did a space launch. Most of the media said, well, this was a mask for a missile launch. Well, maybe. But Kim Jong-il's been watching China. China has started to do space launches. They've made a lot of currency out of doing space launches. They've also stolen a lot of technology from the countries that sent them satellites. What a great return. So if you look at where North Korea has put their next launch pad, it's on the west coast of North Korea. If they were launching a missile from there into the Pacific, the booster would go down probably in China or Russia. So that's not where they're trying to launch to. Their launch place would be directly to the south. And if you're launching into the south, you're trying to do an orbit that's directly over the poles. That's a space launch. That's not a missile launch. He's really trying to position himself for that. But if he is, his launch failed this time. And if he's going to get people to buy his space launch capabilities, he's then got to prove several occasions that he can make it work. So guess what we can expect in the next couple of years? If this is true, probably several more space launches to prove that he can really do it. In addition, he has been threatening other things. He's been threatening more space launches. He's been threatening a nuclear test. He's been threatening to do highly enriched uranium, another path towards nuclear weapons. He hasn't gotten to his end state, and so he's escalating up to the next rung in the ladder. He's expecting that maybe we will escalate again, and he'll need to escalate again. So he's talked about several things. we don't know how far he's prepared to go. And so it's an interesting question of chicken. Who is going to prove to be chicken to pull out of this escalating process? Historically, we've generally been the party that has done that. So what does he want from the future negotiations? Presumably, what he wants is more food, more oil, more support like that, and recognition as an important power for internal purposes. Now, you look at this and you say, if we then make these vague threats that the U.S. has been making of, if he does this, we'll do something, that's generally not going to deter him. And we'll talk about the deterrence logic a little bit more in a few minutes. Okay, so what are the risks to us and to Northeast Asia? Well, risk number one is Kim Jong-il appearing to be more powerful than he is, both for internal and external purposes. This is a cartoon from the LA Times a few years ago, but it's a pretty accurate depiction of where North Korea is. Here's this country which is almost fourth world in its position, not even third world, which he's got a nuclear weapon and now he wants to claim to be a superpower. He wants to be recognized as a nuclear power. And as you look at that situation, what does he want? Well, it gains him tremendous leverage. This is a statement that's written by a North Korean defector, but copying words from a former State Department official, saying that North Korea has been bargaining with four of the most significant countries in the world, not even counting South Korea, and yet they seem to win in most cases. Nuclear weapons is their leverage. What else do they have that gives them power? The second kind of problem you have is proliferation. North Korea building weapons. Now you've got to ask, well, what about South Korea and Japan? South Korea's conservatives have been very concerned in the recent past. They claim that North Korea's nuclear weapons shifts the balance of power to North Korea. In the immediate aftermath of the 2006 nuclear test, one of the major papers in Seoul did a poll of South Koreans. 65% of South Koreans said their country needed their own nuclear weapons program. Now, today, that number would probably be 25, 30% because it's not at the top of their issue list. But if North Korea does another nuclear test, it will suddenly vault up. And if South Korea goes nuclear, been a lot of press that almost certainly Japan would go nuclear. And you could have a regional nuclear arms race that would not be a pleasant situation with them competing with China and with North Korea. You also have to ask, well, what happens if North Korea ever uses these weapons? Well, North Korea has been talking since the early 90s about turning Seoul into a sea of fire. The only way I know that North Korea can convert Seoul into a sea of fire is with a nuclear weapon. And that's actually a pretty good description of what a nuclear weapon would do. So that's what they've been claiming. More recently, they've started talking about turning Japan into a nuclear sea of fire, so making it even clearer. But this isn't just a recent development. Again, going back to the mid-1970s, North Korea's diplomats were talking about, even at that time, them being prepared to target the cities of South Korea and Japan with nuclear weapons, claiming progressively that they already had that ability in the mid-70s. Probably didn't. But certainly may be underlying their thought now. And you might think, well, who would target cities? What bloodthirsty people would do that? Well, if you know anything about our own strategic culture from the 1950s and 1960s, we had a doctrine called assured destruction. It was based upon destroying at least 25% of the Soviet population if they escalated to nuclear weapon use. That was U.S. doctrine. In fact, as early as 1945, this was a statement from the USJCS, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in a now declassified document. It says here in the middle, nuclear weapons can be employed against centers of population with the view of forcing an enemy state to yield through terror and disintegration of national morale. And that was our thinking in the immediate aftermath of World War II of how you use nuclear weapons. Note that in World War II, we didn't use them on military facilities in Japan. We used them on cities. Now, they had military industry in those cities, but we targeted cities. So it's not unusual to expect North Korea might do that. Now, okay, so if you target a city with a nuclear weapon, how bad is it? My difficulty in trying to explain this to people is everybody has a different frame of reference. And so I usually find it easiest for people to get a vision if you bring it home. So let me do that. We have a picture here of Provo, Utah. If a nuclear weapon were put down right at the edge of BYU, what area would be affected? If it's a likely North Korean nuclear weapon, this dotted area would be roughly the distance at which half of the people at that distance would be killed by the weapon, by the explosion. And roughly speaking, that kind of number of fatalities and lots of casualties well out beyond that. So that's with the North Korean-style nuclear weapon, very primitive, very early stage. If they got higher technology within the same size missiles that they could project, you could see weapons that were considerably larger. And then you're affecting a much larger area, a much larger population. So that's the kind of thing that you would get with these weapons. If you take it back to Korea and you apply it to Korea, Korea's got much higher population density, especially in the big cities, than does Provo. And so if, for example, they use 2 nuclear weapons with a small yield, a 10 kiloton yield, you'd have about 600,000 people who would be killed or serious casualties. And if you use a bigger weapon, even more, North Korea is reported to have, by some experts, 5 to 12 nuclear weapons. Personally, I think the number is more, but at least that. Now, nuclear weapons don't just cause casualties, though. They also do a lot of economic damage. And to put that into perspective, think about 9/11. The 9/11 attack in New York City, it caused less than 0.002% fatalities and major casualties within the U.S. And yet, most of the reports say that year we lost 1 to 5% of our gross domestic product. So huge leverage between casualties and economic damage. If indeed North Korea threw a number of nuclear weapons at South Korea and you brought your casualties up into that yellow region, and let's say that's about 5% of South Korea's population, they lost that much population, would their economy be set back a decade or more? Would they be able to inherit North Korea and pay for the unification? Or would they be fulfilling Kim Jong-il's statement to his father that the earth doesn't need to continue without North Korea? Okay, so what can the U.S. do? All right, if you look at deterrence, deterrence is a matter of balancing benefits versus costs. The benefits for North Korea of the recent provocations of their missile launch, there are a number of them. These are only part of the benefits. The costs that they paid primarily were in terms of sanctions. They weren't big sanctions. They were relatively moderate in effect that were put in place. And you look at that and you say, gee, the balance is pretty obvious where they came out. There were a number of other costs that could have been imposed. For example, some of the U.S. military commanders said, they launch a missile, we can shoot it down. Why don't we do that? But the president decided not to do that. Or the South Koreans argued that they would join the Proliferation Security Initiative to try and control North Korean efforts to send weapons of mass destruction overseas. But the South Koreans backed away from that. So these were possible costs that could have been put on there, but weren't. And you say, based upon that, with few costs, why would North Korea have been deterred? They had benefits, they had little cost. Sounded like escalation was a reasonable process. Then you have to say, okay, so how might we deter North Korea from its next provocation? How do we balance that beam so that we come out better? Now, before I get to that, let's turn it and say, if North Korea goes further down this failure process and they get to the point where they actually think about using nuclear weapons, well, in peacetime, if you look at the balance beam, the costs that North Korean would run from retaliation versus the leverage and damage they could get with nuclear weapons, the benefits are outweighed by the costs. They're not shooting nuclear weapons today, so they're deterred. Straightforward. But if their regime is failing and they need to get a situation where they can control the failure and stop it, then those relationships may change. And they may see that the weapon use may bring them more leverage, more opportunity. Retaliation may be less of a concern because they're concerned about the failure of the regime. And in that kind of case, you say, okay, so how do we deter? If our only basis for deterrence is retaliation, we may fail. They may go ahead and use those weapons. The classical deterrence literature talks about two parts of deterrence, though, a combination of retaliation and denial. Denial says we will take action to prevent them from gaining some of the advantages that they think they're going to gain. And so what I want to do on the next couple of slides is talk about what is retaliation potential, what are denial. And we're almost done. Before I do that, though, it says here clearly we've got to balance those two. We've got to use both because retaliation in a wartime situation by itself may be inadequate. All right, starting with retaliation. Some of the U.S. military are prone to say a statement like in the quotes there, but it goes back to the notion of assured destruction we talked about earlier. If North Korea uses a nuclear weapon, well, we'll just destroy the country with hundreds of U.S. nuclear weapons. But I have to ask, why would I want to kill millions of North Korean civilians? I mean, what's the purpose there? Does Kim Jong-il care about those people? Probably not. So why would I do that? And if I did that, and South Korea is going to eventually inherit the North as a unified country, why would the South Korean government want that kind of outcome? So the old doctrine of assured destruction doesn't make much sense here. An alternative is that we would target the North Korean leadership. We'd certainly get at the guilty parties then, but most of them are going to be underground to try and avoid the damage that occurs. And if that happens, when a nuclear weapon hits the ground, it creates fallout. And that fallout can go as far away as South Korea, Japan, China. And do we really want to pollute those countries with fallout? It may not be a good choice. A third alternative is to target the North Korean military. Fortunately, this happens to be U.S. doctrine at this point in time. And that potentially would make the regime non-viable. It would take away their leverage, the center point of their regime. But there are a lot of advocates in the United States who are now talking about going to a nuclear zero, getting rid of all nuclear weapons. Now that sounds like in a lot of ways a good idea, but our regional allies are saying, wait a minute, if you do that, then we need nuclear weapons because we've still got to deter North Korea's nuclear weapon use. So there still is a role for U.S. nuclear weapons, and somehow we've got to balance those issues. What about denial? If you think about the process of using a weapon from having the weapons, launching them, having them explode and have effects, well, if they have effects, you could give hospital care, you could put people in shelters to avoid the damage. But if I look at that, I'd like to have the medical care to be able to deal with a nuclear weapon explosion, but why try to stop it at that point? The damage has already been largely done. And while I could do the shelters, the problem with the shelters is that's expensive. The U.S. tried to do that in the 60s. And it was extremely expensive, and it just wasn't something we found very viable. We could try and go out and use our ability to project power and destroy their command control, their weapons. But if we don't know how many weapons they have in the first place, how can we target them? We certainly don't know where exactly they are in that kind of case. So it becomes difficult to preemptively destroy them. And in brief, that is why the Bush administration so much was interested in missile defense. Now, they were also interested in air defense and in other kinds of defenses, but that was the only part of the equation of denial that still seemed to make sense among the options. And if denial is important, it played a role. All right. This is also psychological, though. On the psychological end, Secretary Gates back in September gave a couple of talks, and he said, fundamentally, we no longer have a ground force U.S. commitment to Korea. The Koreans still believe that if war occurs, we're sending 700,000 American soldiers, Navy and airmen, to Korea. But Secretary Gates has said, we can't send ground forces, no longer capable of doing that. And as the Koreans realize this, they're thinking that we're no longer supporting their security. And what's their alternative? Well, they get driven towards nuclear weapons. So, bottom lines. Summary. Northeast Asia is an important region to the U.S. The economy is growing, it's strong, it's big, it's important. For us to deal with that, we have this North Korea there that's an unstable country. It is at some point in time going to come apart. We don't know when, we don't know how, but we need to be prepared to deal with it. And in the process, it's likely to go through a series of escalating crises. Nuclear weapons, if they actually get used, could dwarf the damage of 9/11, and even short of that, proliferation could destabilize Northeast Asia if Japan and South Korea get these weapons. And so what do we need to be prepared to do? Well, we need to rethink our deterrence, how we're trying to deal with this. We've got to be prepared to deter the provocations and proliferation. We need a strategy for managing these situations. And we've got to decide what our priorities are. Is our priority really Iraq and Afghanistan, or do other areas of the world have priority instead? And that leads me to questions. Please.
Do you think that in the event that Kim Jong-il is saying he's dying and he orders some kind of strike, would they actually carry it out?
Good question. What we know is that the people immediately around Kim Jong-il have all been promoted by him. So they have been hand-chosen. He's done about 1,200 general officer promotions since he became the ruler of the country. So at that level, fairly good chance it would happen. At the level of who's going to push the button, because it's going to be local, much more uncertainty about whether or not it would really happen. But we're not actively pursuing the process of trying to convince those people not to do it. And that would be one of the issues. If we want to do denial, that's a great way to do denial, is to convince them not to do it, and something we should be pursuing. Yes, Roger.
Bruce, is the military in North Korea as organized and as determined as Kim to defend the country?
I think to defend...
Acceptable to negotiation and or bribery?
Yeah, to defend the country today, yes, as it's still coherent. If there were a collapse and you were trying to deal with the collapse of the country, I think there would be civil war in the country because nobody has enough resources to feed the people in their own area. And so there would be efforts to try and steal resources from your neighbors, especially in a criminal-oriented society where they already are. In that kind of a world, there are going to be those who are losers and winners, and the losers probably can be co-opted.
So it seems to me to make a good policy here, I have to know about North Korea and somewhat about South Korea, which you've talked about. But I also have to know about China, and you haven't talked much about China. And maybe I need to know something about Russia.
Yep.
So could you tell me a little bit more about Chinese preferences and actions these days with respect
Sure.
to North Korea?
Yeah, in the very short term, China's attitude is we want something less than 0 North Korean refugees crossing the border. We don't want those refugees here in China. They're destabilizing. We already have 2 million ethnic Koreans who are Chinese citizens and 100,000 or so North Korean refugees here. We don't want any more. So if there were suddenly a collapse of North Korea, the Bank of Korea has estimated you get about 3 million refugees, most of whom would move towards China. That's something China does not want. There is increasing evidence that in that kind of circumstance, Chinese military forces would cross the border. Don't know for sure, but there's a lot more evidence growing that they would. Probably not headed towards Pyongyang, but you never know. At least trying to control the refugees and stop them before they cross into China. So that's sort of their short-term concern. Their medium to longer term concerns are, one, they don't want the U.S. up on their border, so they don't want us moving military forces into North Korea. Soviet Union did a similar deal with us not to move military forces into East Germany when Germany came apart. We haven't made that kind of deal with China yet. They're also concerned about the general loss of a buffer to an outside capitalistic society in South Korea. And they're not certain that they would like that, all of Korea becoming capitalistic and unified and strong. So China has a variety of concerns in that regard. We don't really know for sure what they're prepared to do, other than probably at least some border kinds of actions. And we don't know what North Korea is prepared to do. For example, if Chinese forces cross into North Korea to control the refugees, well, North Korean missiles don't just fly to the south. They could also fly to the north or to the west into China. And you have to ask, would Kim Jong-il consider that? Because if he did that, the Chinese experts I talk about say one shot like that and the Chinese are headed at least for Pyongyang.
So partly from what I hear you say, if I can just offer a quick follow-up.
Sure.
So it is in China's interest that North Korea not fall apart and that North Korea not behave terribly badly. Doesn't that suggest that China could be a bit of a help in managing the situation? And how much help are they? Do they have much influence there? And have they been?
Yeah, and the answer is absolutely they'd like to manage it. In fact, China is this ascendant regional power, and it would like, according to power politics, to be able to influence people and to be able to convince people, hey, you know, if we tell you to do X, do it. And it's not working with North Korea. I mean, in July of 2006, one day they said, we're sending a major delegation to Pyongyang to convince them not to launch missiles. The next day, Pyongyang launches its missiles. It was one of those in-your-face kinds of things. Similar kind of thing happened with the nuclear tests. North Korea always does these build-ups to these provocations. China sent a major delegation to North Korea to stop the nuclear test. North Korea sets it off. They give China, I think it was 2 hours notice of the test. It was not what a weak state, you know, that's subservient to China should be doing. And they are consistently in the face of China. And China consistently says we have very little leverage, but we don't want to give up what little leverage we have left. So we'll try, but we don't seem to be able to get much response there. And in part that's because they don't want to push the state over the edge, over that fall-off in viability. They'd much rather just have North Korea there as a buffer, even if it's a largely failed state. Please.
Some have criticized the U.S. intelligence community for not really knowing very much about North Korea, and even describing North Korea as a black box in terms of what we know. What things do we not know that would help us understand the situation better, or help us might address the nuclear crisis?
Well, part of the problem that you have is that North Korea has gotten very adept at hiding. For example, anytime North Korea does these provocations, usually a week or two beforehand, Kim Jong-il disappears, and 4 to 6 weeks later, he reappears. And, you know, at least publicly, we have no idea where he is in that interval. He's very good at hiding. They're very good at hiding a variety of things. So the difficulty our intelligence people have is, how do you get agents into North Korea with all the secret police? Very difficult. How do you get information out? Well, you get it out with defectors, But are the defectors telling you what they think you want to hear or the reality? How do you know for sure what you're hearing is real and you don't have good the intelligence community wants cross-confirmation to make sure that they've got real information. And it's very difficult to get there. Key things they'd like to know a lot more about the regime relationships. They'd like to know where their weapons are, how many they have, what kinds of capabilities they've got. But it's very, very difficult to get that kind of information. And like I said earlier, in North Korea, you spill anything like that, and you're at least headed to the gulag, if not dead. And so they are very controlled in that kind of thing. Now, things do leak, but it's a limited amount. Please.
So it really is looking like North Korea is really just kind of standing on its own in that area. If, say, the regime, got real worried that they thought they might collapse, would anybody stand next to them? Any other states or anything?
Well, China would probably stand next to them to the extent of morally supporting them and trying to dissuade us from sending troops in, while they themselves send troops in. So, there would be some support like that. There would be a moral support kind of thing. So I don't think China is going to go away in that kind of regard. But they're about it at this stage. The Soviets or the Russians don't seem to have much influence there anymore. A little bit, but not much.
Question, Bruce?
Yeah.
What's Japan going to do about the issue?
Japan, it used to be forbidden in Japan to really talk about nuclear weapons. They have 3 principles in Japan about not having nuclear weapons, not having the technologies, and I think, I can't remember the third. In any case, that's been violated in recent years in the terms of they've started to talk about having nuclear weapons. Not broadly, but it started. And North Korea has roughly, we believe, about 100 kilograms of plutonium. Japan has in store thousands of kilograms of plutonium, tons of plutonium. So if they decided to cross the threshold, some of their politicians have said they could have 3,000 nuclear weapons within a short period of time. And you can imagine what destabilizing that would do. China's at about, you never know with China either, but we think China's probably about 500 nuclear weapons. If Japan started building nuclear weapons, what's China going to do?
One more question, and we probably need to end.
Okay.
The little diagram of nuclear proliferation, you showed Japan giving it to Taiwan. Do you think that would be...
No, it's not so much giving it as if Japan goes nuclear, what happens to the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Yeah, the Non-Proliferation Treaty probably dies, and the Taiwanese seem to be watching that as a precedent of if we don't sanction Japan in that case, which we might not, then can't they get away with it too? And so it's that influence that the Taiwanese are talking about. And it's not broadly discussed in Taiwan, but some.
Thank you very much. I think we've all learned a ton. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Darren.